In this video, I wanted to go through and check the solution that I gave you against the rubric. Um, Most of you guys picked up on some of the key issues that were going on. Some of you picked up on one, but not another. So let's go through this in detail. The first and biggest, unambiguously, a mistake is right here. We should not have declared digit list. The reason is if you read the directions, a digit list is already defined as a field of the digits class. So what actually happens if I define that there is it creates a local copy, and therefore it kind of negates everything I'm doing because everything I'm doing is just for the local copy as opposed to the field level variable. So this is a mistake. I don't know if you guys would have made this type of mistake. Um, Probably not. I don't think you've done all this a lot, but something to be aware of. If you're given a private field, you need to use that in the constructor to get things set up. The next line, creating a temp, that's probably not really necessary. It's an understandable impulse that you would want to create a temp so you could make sure you hang on to your original value of num in case you need to use it again. But upon refactoring, you would realize you don't really need it. However, it doesn't do any harm. So no points would be deducted for that. It states explicitly that putting extra code in there that's not necessary and doesn't have any bad side effect, you're not going to lose points for. So that's not needed, but fine. What else is missing here is you need special handling for the case when the num is equal to 0. If you don't handle that case, then you're not going to put anything into the list. So you could just write an if statement there. So like if num or temp num is equal to 0, then you add 0 to your digit list. That would be a way of special handling it. Uh, Now, if we look at um, the while loop basically works. When I go through here, I'm adding basically the last digit, and then I chop off the last digit. So it's sort of this does the add here, and this does the chop. And it's going to keep going down until it puts everything in the list. The problem, and as a lot of you guys saw, it's going to make the list backwards because by default, add will add to the end. If you wanted to make it add to the beginning, you would have to do something like add and then put in a 0. So it'd have to be like add, 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 and then you put in a 0, and then you would put in whatever number. And that would allow you to add at the beginning rather than at the end of the list. That was pretty subtle, but something you need to be aware of. Really, it's going to be important for this test to really know our array list inside, backwards, and upside down. We've been using them a little bit, but we want to work out those skills a little bit as we go too. All right, so now let's look at what actual grade I did. So the first thing, I would not get the point for constructs digit list. Sorry, that point's missing. And the reason that it's missing is because of the first thing I told you, which was I declared my array list again. I should not have had this part in here where I said array list of an integer because it's already declared as an array list of integer. And that's exactly what this is referring to. So this is basically the issue. I don't want to reinitialize a local variable. All right, so that point's gone. Do I identify a digit in num? Yes, I do. That's basically what I'm doing here is I'm identifying the digits. Do I add at least, so that part's good. Do I add at least one identified digit to the list? Yeah, certainly. This actually adds everything. It just does them in the wrong order. So good on that account. Adds all identified digits to the list. Is it inside the loop? Am I making sure I get everything and not just getting a couple things? Yeah, I get everything. I'm just missing that one special case. So I think that this point has been earned. So that's 3 points. But then on the exit, um, I'm not going to get the point for that. Digit list, first of all, it's not really going to contain anything because of my initial problem. Although if I didn't do the initial thing, I probably would give credit for that because it would be kind of double counting the same root of the error. It can get a little tricky in here, but the reason you would not get credit for this has to do with my reverse order. Remember when I just had the blank add statement without having the parameter of 0? That results in me creating the list in a reverse order. Therefore, I would not get the point. So overall, what would I give this? I would say that this first response would be a 3 out of a 5. 3 out of 5. So overall, when you guys evaluated this, you did, it was sort of hard for me to see exactly who said what, where, but definitely a lot of you identified these issues. But overall, the aggregate of the score that you gave this was a little bit high. There were really two big errors. The first error, I think, was pretty easy one to avoid. The last one, in terms of putting the 0 in here, was that's a little tricky, but it's something we need to get used to and something we can do. You want to think every time about what order you're putting things in. And the sort of error that's in there too that could have created a problem if I didn't have the other ones is a lack of special handling for the 0. Let's just scroll down a little bit. I want to show you kind of what you guys thought. You might have looked at that. All right, let me pause for a sec. Okay, so this is what I was talking about. A lot of you guys gave it a 4 out of 5, when I think a 3 out of 5 would have been a better answer. You'd have to have been grading it really harshly to give it 2 out of 5. And definitely there were mistakes, so it did not earn a 5 out of 5. So that's where we are with the first one. Let's take a look at the second one. Scroll down, scroll down. All right, solution part B is strictly increasing. This guy had 2 major mistakes, and a lot of you guys noticed it. Almost everybody noticed at least one. Some didn't notice both things. So the first thing is this first one. This type of error is going to happen all the time. So you really got to be careful about this. This loop condition, it should have had a -1 in there. Reason being is later I have a +1, right? So if I don't have that -1 and later I have a +1, the index is going to go out of bounds. And that's that's going to create the out of bounds error. Many of you guys alerted to that. The other thing is, remember, this is strictly increasing. Strictly increasing. Now I return false basically if any given thing is greater than 0. That means I'm only returning false if the one is greater than the element before it. Actually, this should be greater than or equal to. Greater than or equal to. Because an equality between 2 adjacent elements is enough that it's not going to pass the test of strictly increasing. Strictly increasing means that, each one has to be more than the one before it, not equal to. Okay, so those were the errors. Let's take a look back and see where some of you which we should have got points off for. Okay, compares at least one identified pair of consecutive elements. I'd say we did that, certainly, right? We compared the element in the one before it. Determines if it is out of order. Okay, so here's the first mistake we made. Failed to consider the case where 2 elements are equal for the false case. So lose that point. compares all necessary consecutive pairs, no bounds error. Oops. Well, we know that we have the bounds error, right? Because of that -1. That is something you really, really need to be tight on. You really need to give some thought to those bounds errors. And I know it's different when you're just looking at somebody else's work. Um, but remember, whenever you're doing your own work, be very careful about what the bound conditions are going to be. All right, then the last case returns true if and only if all consecutive pairs are in order, false otherwise. Um, I'd say that that's true. It is a little bit, okay, compare consecutive pairs, um, but fail to consider the case when two elements are equal. Yeah, so it's a little dicey too, to be honest with you. So, hmm, I was originally thinking maybe a 2 out of 4, but a 1 out of 4 might be more appropriate. So this is not the easiest thing in the world to, whoops, change colors there. Not the easiest thing in the world to compare. So yeah, I mean, both of this one and this one talk about the idea of two elements being equal. It's not really a separate error. So I'd have to look back at maybe some of the other examples and see how strict it was on that. But the strictly increasing was very clear. I mean, that's the name of the method. So if you didn't get that right, um, so I'd say this is either a 1 out of 4 or a 2 out of 4, maybe if we're being generous. It kind of has the basic idea, but it makes some pretty critical errors. So that's what we need to look at. All right. If you are still with me, this video is starting to get long, but if you're still with me, I wanted to talk briefly. There's another thing I wanted to mention about the first problem, which is a little bit not central, because there's an alternative way you could have handled the whole thing by using strings. So let's pause from here and take a look back at the top. Okay, for those of you who are still with me, I wanted to talk about a different way you might have approached this. Um, One way to separate the digits is by this combination of a mod and a division, but you could have also done it by considering it a string and doing a string and using like a char add or a substring. So if you did it that way or were thinking about it that way, I just want to talk to you through how, what you needed to look out for. So it does sort of allow for that possibility. The first thing you would do is you would create a new string based on the num. You'd use a string constructor. I'm pretty sure you can pass an int for a string constructor and just turn it into a string. And then you can kind of go through and take the digits one by one, using substring or char add. The key thing there, and what I wanted to talk about, is if you do that, you need to make sure that the digits go back to being integers before you do that. And so what you could do is you could use methods of integers or the constructor of integer to change back. So that's a little bit trickier, right? Because you need to make sure that what you're putting into the array list is not a string, but it's an integer object. And that's what some of these other things are talking about. Treat the number itself as a string. Okay, so you would have lost credit if you did that and then you treated the number as a string, or if you didn't convert it correctly. So you have to be careful, and you would have to review your documentation. It's not something we did a ton of, right? Parse int, I believe, is the method name in string, or you probably could do it using the constructor. I'd have to double check on that. But if you didn't do it properly and you're trying to put a string into an integer array list, then you got problems. Likewise, if you did the char at and you tried to put a char in there, that's not going to work. So again, you would need to change it into an integer object. So that's one of the complications, and that's why I chose personally to stick with the method that I did here, which is to use the mod and the division in order to keep them as numbers anyway. And an advantage of that is basically you have something called auto boxing that works for you. In other words, when you even though that this is a integer object, you can put an int primitive directly in it. And what happens is the runtime environment will actually just do the conversion for you, right? So if this, you'll notice here, I'm actually putting this is going to resolve to an int primitive, but that int primitive will be automatically converted to an integer object before it's put into the array. So it kind of makes it a little easier and does some of the working for you. That phenomenon is called auto boxing, and it's makes things handy. It works in a very intuitive way to let you kind of use a primitive as an integer object and makes it more usable, but you just want to make sure that you're aware of when you're doing it and thinking that through. Anyway, that's the little addendum that I wanted to add. Thank any of you guys who are still with me, but hopefully this made some more sense. Thank you.